Good evening, folks. Welcome. Y'all are getting quiet like you're ready for the church service. I hope you're being properly prayerful in preparation. So I'm Alan Jacobs, and I teach in the honors program here. And it's my great privilege to have Ross Douthat here. I'm going to grill him mercilessly. So y'all just pray for the repose of his soul while this goes on. I do hope it will be a relatively friendly conversation. So as many of you will know, Ross is a columnist for the New York Times, which you've been doing for a decade now, right? At the Times? Is it a decade?
Is that true?
I don't know.
I can neither confirm nor deny. Okay. I guess it has been, yeah.
Yeah, it just feels like a lot longer, no doubt. And Ross is the author of several books. Was Privilege your first one, or was it Grand New Party?
Privilege.
Privilege was his first book, and then with Reihan Salam, the new president or director or whatever he is of the president of the Manhattan Institute. Yeah. They wrote a book called Grand New Party about the reform of the Republican Party, a party which took all of their advice and has become everything that they had hoped that it would be.
In one sense.
So thanks be to God for that. And has more recently he wrote a book which I wrote a blurb for, Bad Religion: How We Became a Nation of Heretics. And then he had been working for some time on a project about decadent societies, and set that aside for a while because he thought that this Pope Francis guy might be of interest and needed to be brought to the attention of the American public who otherwise might not know anything about him. And so this is his most recent book, To Change the Church, Pope Francis and the Future of Catholicism. We have both of these books for sale out in the lobby, and we would be delighted. Ross's family would be delighted if you were to buy copies, and then he would be glad to sign them for you. And so having dealt with Pope Francis in an appropriate way, Ross has now returned to the topic of decadent societies. And that's when I talked to him about coming here, that was my first suggestion for a topic, and he eagerly seized upon it. So that's what we're going to discuss tonight. I want to find out what Ross thinks about it, or at least as much as he's willing to tell us before his book comes out. So would you please join me in welcoming Ross Douthat? Let's have a seat. So we're doing the fireside chat kind of.
This is the more decadent way to conduct
yeah, I think that's right. We're not even on our feet. Yes, that's decadent indeed. So I have a set of questions for you. And I thought we should begin by just talking about what does it mean to say that society is decadent. I think that's often used to mean something like failing, as in the failing New York Times, a phrase that I've heard from someone. I can't remember whom I've heard that from. But
our numbers are very good this year. They're very good. They're the best numbers.
That's right, the very best.
Yeah, the very best.
I'm so glad to hear it. But decadence can't mean just failing, because there are many societies which have failed, presumably through no fault of their own. So there must be something more to the concept of decadence, something other to the concept of decadence than that. So can you give us a first start on thinking about what decadence is?
Sure, or I can attempt one and you can tell me whether it's plausible. But yeah, I mean, it seems like there are sort of high and low definitions of decadence, right? The sort of low definition is just a sort of colloquial, these chocolates are really decadent. Right. I went on a weekend in Vegas, it was super decadent, where it just sort of means, lavish and moderately sinful or something.
As people right now are having Shrove Tuesday.
Right, it's the Mardi Gras.
New Orleans, and
yes.
That's decadent.
Yes.
Yeah. This is what you guys do for Shrove Tuesday.
Right,
this is how you blow it out.
This is quite a Mardi Gras, and I appreciate all of you, deciding to really, really go crazy with us tonight. We'll be doing a kind of mini carnival outside afterwards if you stick around. But then there's sort of there's sort of attempts to do a kind of high form where it becomes this sort of comprehensive civilizational indictment. And I think those attempts at indictment usually do sort of assume that decadence means that failure is imminent, right? That there's sort of the cliched image is, the feast of Belshazzar, right? The writing is on the wall while you're eating your suckling pig or something, or the Roman orgies are happening while the barbarians are coming across the frontier, or while they're on the doorstep of Rome, I guess. And so my attempt at a definition is trying to suggest that basically that combination is wrong, right? And that decadence creates certain vulnerabilities to failure, but it's not synonymous with failure. And in fact, the best way to think about decadence is to think about it as a kind of, let's say, drift, stagnation, and repetition at a high level of civilizational development, right? So that sort of excludes a bunch of different things from possibly being decadent, right? So, a very poor society cannot really be decadent, right? A sort of undeveloped society can't be decadent. A chaotic society can't really be decadent. You have to have achieved a certain, obviously this is all subject to, to sort of competing assessments, but you have to achieve a certain level of civilizational advancement. And then you can't be sort of dynamic and decadent, right? And so something like, the 1920s America or Gilded Age America in the late 19th century, those situations will sometimes get described as decadent. And under my narrower definition, they're not. Right. Because, they might have been sinful, they might have been corrupt in various ways, but they were periods of dramatic change, enormous energy, right? The sins were sort of, they were big sins, right?
Sins of boldness.
Of boldness, exactly. Yeah. The robber barons, whatever else they were doing, they were sinning boldly, let's say. So to get to decadence, you have to sort of get rich and get advanced, and then you have to get stuck. But that stuckness can then last a long time, right? And, in actual historical terms, the image of Roman orgies that people associate with, let's say, Nero or something, is separated by 400 years of history from the fall of the Western Roman Empire. And, if you take something, I think a civilizational period that most people would agree was decadent, right? Like the late Ottoman Empire or China after 1725 or something. I mean, the late Ottoman Empire was the Ottoman Empire was the sick man of Europe for a very long time. Right. And sort of Chinese decadence, however we define it, seemed to last probably hundreds of years before, Western imperial powers delivered a kind of coup de grace. So in all of those ways, I mean, obviously what this is building up to is an argument that we are decadent, right? And
no way.
And that the way, right? I've given away the ending, but that what distinguishes that decadence is this sense of sort of being stuck with the same arguments, the same artistic patterns, and even fashions and architecture and all of these things, and also not actually growing and changing and revolutionizing ourselves as fast as people, I think, sort of casually assume that we are. So to the extent that, like, under my definition of decadence, it's counterintuitive to say that the Western world right now is decadent, it's because people sort of assume that, this is a dynamic era. Everything's changing really rapidly. Whatever else is going on, this is a revolutionary time because of the internet, and the robots are going to take our jobs tomorrow, and the day after that we're going to upload our brains to the singularity and so on. And if that's right, then we're not decadent. But I don't think that's right. I think I tend to agree with the smaller but I think smarter group of people who think we're more stagnant than we are dynamic in a lot of ways.
Yeah. The great stagnation.
Right. There's sort of a group of economists and some people in Silicon Valley and some economic historians, Robert Gordon, some others who have made smarter versions of this argument, basically, that the Western world since the 1970s has had sort of one technological revolution, the internet revolution. But that in every other area, we've seen a lot of technological stagnation relative to what people expected 50 years ago, and that in turn is connected to slow economic growth, disappointing wage growth, all of these things that sort of undergird our politics. And yeah, and I find that basically convincing. I think people are, because the internet revolution is so sort of palpable, right? You always have this thing with you, and you're always sort of dipping into it, and it's sort of reconstructing your daily life. You think of it, and the thing itself, right? Like it creates, if you're on Twitter or Facebook, you have this sense of like world history is cascading, right? Every day something dramatic is happening and so on. But that's an artifact of the technology. It doesn't reflect, I think, the events themselves and how fast they're happening. I think so.
There's the science fiction, the novelist, he writes things other than science fiction, Neil Stephenson, has been making a version of this intellectual and technological stagnation argument.
Right.
He has a great, I think it's Stephenson, who has this great passage where he says, if you sort of move through history in 75-year chunks, that if you go from 1500 to 1575, things look pretty much the same, and then you jump ahead to 1650 and things look pretty much the same. And even by the time you get to, let's say, 1875, it doesn't look that much different than it had looked hundreds of years before. And then between 1875 and 1950, the world is completely transformed. You take somebody from 1875 and put them in 1950, and they don't recognize anything around them. But he says you move from 1950 to now, not so much. Not so much. I mean, the cars look a little different, the clothes look a little different, but it's not a dramatic change. And so his feeling is that there has been an enormous stagnation in recent years, but that it's a kind of a return to the norm.
Right.
That is that what happened roughly in the first half of the 20th century gives us a kind of a distorting lens and maybe throws off our expectations. So what's reasonable to expect a society to be able to do in this?
No, and I think should sort of, there is a sense in which decadence is a kind of normal, a very normal state for a civilization. I don't think it's an exceptional phenomenon at all, and it feels exceptional in part because we did have this sort of, the Industrial Revolution is the exception, right? And
that level of dynamism is
is absolutely historically exceptional. So in that sense, you could say, I think you would tell the story and say more like 1825 to 1975 than 1875 to 1950. So you have a solid 150-year period of sort of really radical technological and economic change. And it may simply be unreasonable to expect that to continue. And there is, there's a case for decadence, right? Like there's an argument that all decadence means is sort of a civilization, entering a kind of sustainable phase, right? And since we're sort of overshadowed at this moment by debates about climate change and sort of, limits to growth and the extent to which that big industrial leap may be sort of, wrecking the climate of our planet. I think it's very plausible to sort of look at decadence and say, well, we got rich and that's good, and now we're stuck and that's maybe not so good, but there are certainly many, many worse alternatives. But I also think, there are ways in which, the technological change of that period is exceptional in all the course of human history. But there are other ways in which you can have a society where technologies aren't changing every day, but where there's a sense of sort of cultural dynamism, right? And I mean, I think what's distinctive about our era is that you have different forms of decadence sort of converging, right? Like sort of undergirding all of this, right? Like it is extremely exceptional in all of human history that the Western world is not reproducing itself right now. Like one of the constituent elements of decadence right now is that literally Western societies don't have enough babies to sustain their current population. And that has all kinds of spillover effects in sort of economics and technology. Like there's a lot of data now on that basically explains some of the technological and economic slowdown with reference to the fact that the world is getting older and aging societies are less innovative, less dynamic, less open to risk-taking, and so on. But then it also connects to cultural stuff. Older societies are just more cautious, more set in their ways, and less likely to try new things in general. And then we also we also have a society, right, that is set up around the expectation of change. Yeah. And that is, I think, a big part of what makes sort of this decadence more unsettling than stagnation would have been in a different society, right? Like traditional societies are set up around the expectation of repetition, of continuity, right? Of the idea that we're sort of engaged in this transmission of tradition between the generations and so on. Whereas the whole modern project basically says we're going to get rid of that transmission. We're going to get rid of rootedness and and hierarchy and a sense of like sort of that you have a place and an inheritance that you're transmitting to the next generation. And to compensate for getting rid of that, we promise that tomorrow will be better than today, right? That there's this sort of constant change and churn that's very alienating in the ways that the 19th century Marxists identified. But the benefits are so large, the material benefits, the ability to get up and move and go somewhere else and start your life anew and so on, that it more than compensates for the disruption of rooted arrangements. And so if that compensation stops being what it is promised to be, then you're left with a society that doesn't have traditional structures anymore, that's sort of a hyper-individualist society in many ways, and that is getting sort of the costs of modernity without the promised benefits, which are sort of intangible and psychic as well as material, right? Like, the promised benefit of the space program, right, is not that it's going to necessarily lift your material prospects immensely, though it might, right? I think there was an assumption that the Apollo project would have all these spillovers and so on, and on occasion it did. But it's also a kind of, psychic, spiritual sort of like there's this idea that I think you've probably blogged about, the technological sublime, right? That I think it goes back to Perry Miller, maybe, but there's a guy named David Nye who's written about it, right? Which is that basically American society generated, reliably and consistently across most of its history, these kind of moments of technological achievement that were, that were sublime, that they were sort of awe-inspiring and were sort of moments that the nation as a whole participated in. The Transcontinental Railroad, the Hoover Dam, the building of the skyscrapers. And this all sort of culminates with the space program. And then there really hasn't been anything since, except the internet, which is a technology of simulation, which is, I think, it may be remarkable, but it's a very different kind of thing. So you lose sort of the promise of ever-increasing material prosperity, and you also lose the promise that bound up in this somehow will be this kind of sublime elevation of the spirit. And what you're left with is a kind of sort of simmering discontent, I think.
As I know it's maybe a little, it makes me a little uneasy to quote Louis C.K. right now, but there is the passage where he's talking about why he doesn't let his routine, where he talked about why he didn't let his kids have cell phones, and he said, that ultimately they get to the position where you're kind of satisfied with your devices, and then you die. and which is a dark way to put it. But I want to tease out some in the answers that you've given so far. You've talked about energy, dynamism, and change, and how that manifests itself in the technological and economic arenas. Societies that are becoming richer, that are becoming more materially productive, that are more technologically neophilic, finding always new and exciting things. But then you've also suggested that there is there can be moral components and even aesthetic components to the overall shape of the society. And I'm wondering how those things, if a society begins to lose its economic and technological energy, will it lose its moral energy at the same time? Will it lose its, you suggested that you can fall into a kind of a sameness of aesthetics as well. And so does dynamism decline across these different areas simultaneously, or can one area decline and the other compensate for it? How do you think about that?
I think you have to assume that all these areas are separable, right? That that a society can become decadent in one area and not in another, and that just to take the sort of distinctiveness of the Industrial Revolution, right? Like clearly, pre-modern societies would have these sort of great moments of aesthetic flourishing that were not contingent on having late 19th century rates of economic growth, right? Now, so they have to be separable to some extent. At the same time, there is a sort of suggestive correlation, right? That the Italian Renaissance starts before the age of discovery, right? So it's not, the Italian Renaissance doesn't cause Columbus to discover America exactly, and the Columbian Exchange and the wealth of the Indies doesn't cause Michelangelo to paint the Sistine Chapel, but they are sort of happening together around the same time as the Copernican Revolution. And I don't think it's crazy to assume that there are sort of feedback loops. And you can tell, I think, a pretty obvious story in the case of sort of what you might call moral dynamism. I think it's the economist named Benjamin Friedman has a book called The Moral Consequences of Economic Growth, where he basically argues that, economic growth makes people more open to moral claims from, minority groups, people who've suffered, people who are, so again, you might say it's not a coincidence, comrade, as the Marxists would say, that you get, the real burst of energy around the civil rights movement after the big post-war economic expansion kicks off. That American society in the late 50s feels sort of rich enough that people are like, this is an incredibly crude way of putting it, but people are like, okay, well, maybe we can sort of turn our attention to the plight of Black Americans under segregation in a way that that turn wouldn't have happened in the depths of the Great Depression. So I think there is an entanglement there, right? And if you look at if you look at like the 1960s as, in a sense, and this is a weird claim in a way for a conservative to make, right? Because as conservatives, we're always trashing the 1960s and talking about how the baby boomers destroyed America and so on. But I think under my framework of decadence, the 60s into the 70s look like the last dynamic period in American history. And they're a period when, you have all these things happening together. You have this huge post-war expansion. You have a set of moral revolutions, some of which may have been mistaken, but were certainly moral revolutions. You have a sort of spike in creativity. You don't have to like rock and roll to look back and say that was a spike in aesthetic creativity. The 70s Hollywood, I think, is arguably a particular kind of aesthetic peak. I can do a whole discussion about decadence as it manifests in the trajectory of the Star Wars movies, but maybe we can get into that in the Q&A. And you also have, but then it's also about fashion, right? Like, sit down and watch the first season of Mad Men, right? Which is set in 1959 to 1960, right? And then watch the Woodstock documentary. And if you gave those two programs to someone who knew nothing about American history and said, well, how much time separates the world depicted in Mad Men and the world depicted in the Woodstock documentary, they would say 100 years, right? I mean, this is a more condensed version of the Stevenson point, right? The change wrought by the counterculture, and of course Woodstock was an outlier and so on, but you could just do it with fashion from 1975, right? Just compare it to the fashion of Mad Men. You have just this tremendous turnover. Or think about Back to the Future, right? Back to the Future is a movie made and set in 1985 about a kid who goes back in time from 1985 to 1955. And we are now as far from Marty McFly's Reagan-era America as he was from Hill Valley, the fictional town. And you just couldn't, you could do a Back to the Future that goes back to the 80s, and you'd be like, oh, they got some shoulder pads, and they don't have cell phones, and, they don't support same-sex marriage. Like, there have obviously been changes, but the shock just wouldn't work. And in fact, it doesn't. I was just reading a review of the new Marvel movie, Captain Marvel, which is set in like the early 1990s, which amazingly and horribly to me is now 25 years ago, right? And they're like, there just isn't enough actual change, except for, again, the cell phone, to make that world seem sort of alien in a way that actually justifies saying that, we're showing you a world in a different time. We're creating culture shock by going back to that time. So I think they are. I think there does seem to be a way in which there are sort of, again, feedback loops of creativity and dynamism, and also feedback loops of decadence. And they connect cultural change, religious change. I mean, right. So like, one of the interesting things in writing this fine book available in the lobby and at other booksellers near you is that, Pope Francis, right, is in certain ways, he seems like a non-decadent figure, right? Like, he's a change agent. He's in the papal palace, or not even living in the papal palace. Right. He's shaking things up. He's opening all these debates in Roman Catholicism that the last two popes have seemed to sort of declare closed. It's very interesting. And yet, at the level of religious ideas, it's, the book I wrote before had this long section about religious debates from the 60s and 70s, and they're the same debates. Yeah. There have been some shifts, and obviously sort of homosexuality looms larger, but the basic argument of like, well, how should Christianity adapt to the sexual revolution, and sort of these sort of liberal versus conservative positions, traditionalists versus modernists, it's the same argument 50 years later. And Francis has sort of revived it in certain ways, but I think in many ways what's been exposed is just how much Catholicism, like every other religious denomination in the West, is sort of, it's stuck in the same kind of arguments, except now, if you go back to the 60s in Catholicism, it's like these theological titans. Yeah. It's Karl Rahner going at it with Ratzinger, and there's sort of these great journals that are sort of fighting it out. And now the arguments in Catholicism are a bunch of like hack journalists yelling at each other about the Pope on Twitter. Well, that's right. There's a separate question about sort of the sort of Marshall McLuhan question, right, about how technology affects debates. But it's just striking that we're having the same debates, and the quality seems to have diminished. And that's where you do get into this question of, well, maybe doesn't decadence have to mean decline at a certain point, right? Like if you're just repeating yourself, you're going to get decay at a certain point.
But, so I want to come back to the current moment in the U.S. In a few minutes, but I want to maybe prepare for that by asking you. So there are various societies that people, as you've already mentioned, right? When you say decadence, people think of Rome. And when I was asked to Rome in the time of Nero, or maybe Rome a little later, when I was asked to come up with an image that we could use for this, I came up with one of those famous paintings of the decadence of Rome, which they didn't use because it was probably a little too racy. But Byzantium, people talk about the long decadence of the Byzantine Empire. But these are arguable points, as you have suggested. What societies would you say? Can you name a society that you would say was unmistakably decadent, that sort of ticks all the boxes, and why would you say that one does? You just had to pick one. You don't have to pick just one.
I mean, I think I think the example of China in sort of the second half of the second millennium is a case where of sort of generally agreed upon, including by the Chinese themselves, which is obviously an important part, decadence. And it even comes with this sort of historical hinge moment, right, in the 15th century when you have, this Chinese admiral around the same time as Columbus, doing incredible sea voyages that sort of prefigure the age of discovery, but don't actually lead to Chinese colonization.
Nobody's interested.
And the Chinese bureaucratic elite, it's a little more complicated, I think, than this. As always, history is always more complicated than just, they weren't interested in exploring and they shut it down, but they did ultimately shut it down. And so there was this moment when China could have been a sort of exploratory civilization, and instead Europe became the exploratory civilization. And, China, you could date it where you want, but China passed into decadence, I think. And, and the Ottoman Empire on a slightly more compressed time horizon, right? After the mid to late 17th century, it becomes pretty obvious that the Ottoman Empire is sort of stagnant and sclerotic in some profound way. And I mean, part of this too is sort of it's institutions, right? One thing we haven't talked about that I think is important to thinking about this is like, do your institutions work?
Yeah.
Right? Like, and the story of Rome, right, is that you have sort of the decadence of the Republic, where Republican institutions cease to work, followed by a pretty successful attempt under Augustus to sort of establish an imperial system that works, falls apart a bit in the Nero period, then works again for about 100 years, falls apart again, works again, Diocletian, Constantine, and then sort of falls apart a final time. So clearly, and this is also important, clearly you can have decadence and then renewal, right? Like that's obviously possible, and sort of decadence, in fact, in certain ways calls out for renewal, even as it can frustrate attempts at that. But that to me is sort of part of it, right? If you have political institutions that seem capable of addressing big challenges, as by the 18th century it was, and certainly the 19th century, it was clear that neither the Ottomans nor the Chinese did. And again, that seems like a feature of early 21st century Western life, is that that's I think a point where there's sort of bipartisan agreement at this point in our polarized society that Western institutions don't function well.
Even you can have situations where the institutions are structurally as sound as they had never been, but they can function poorly because the people who are inhabiting them do not. I'm talking about Congress right now, of course. I'm talking about a Congress which has sort of systematically abandoned its own prerogatives, and that does look like a kind of decadence. I'm sorry, I'm back to America. I didn't mean to get back to America just
Sorry,
yet.
I did it.
You did.
I
Okay, I blame you.
apologize.
Good. I want to go back to China for just a moment.
But people are going to want to talk about Donald Trump. That's all. You know,
Yeah.
you gotta. This is America in 2019. We have to
I-
bring it to Donald Trump at some point.
I'm all about just holding off the inevitable as long as possible.
Well, you have to keep them wanting more. Right?
Yeah.
That's
So, but a question about China, because I think it's sort of interesting in general terms as well as in specific terms. Presumably, there's a lot of questions about the sustainability of the current Chinese regime,
right.
Economically and politically, but I don't think anybody would say it's a decadent society.
No.
Probably. Yeah, I'm sure somebody does.
Yeah, go on.
But the energy that Chinese society does have, certainly far greater than the energy of late imperial China.
Yes.
And there's more dynamism in a range of ways there. But to what extent do we think of it as just simply a new society that has been, Mao did what he wanted to do and reconstituted the society in completely new terms? And to what extent do you think of it as these are kind of oscillations within cultural continuity? That there was a decline of this culture to which the culture found a kind of answer, so that there is continuity of Chinese identity over time. In other words, to what extent is this a new society and therefore dynamic, or to what extent is it drawing on ancient resources that were just abandoned or neglected during the imperial decline?
I mean, I think the obvious answer is that it's both.
Yeah.
Right? But it's both, I think, in a sense that's instructive, right? If China's non-decadence persists, if we look back 200 years from now and say, well, yes, the West entered into decadence and China passed it by, I think you will tell a story where basically the new Chinese model was a mix of not so much, I think it's very hard to tell a story where the Mao era was anything but a catastrophe, except maybe arguably insofar as what China had lost was unity above all at that particular moment and needed unity. And so Mao's totalitarianism gave it unity, which then enabled sort of his successors to, not be world historical monsters.
Yeah.
But I think the story you would tell of a Chinese Renaissance is basically a mix of the importation of certain Western models and ideas and technologies that helped lead to rapid development, united with a kind of rediscovered Confucian culture, or perhaps a kind of weird Confucian Christian new hybrid in a sense, which could be developing in China.
It could very well be.
So it's sort of internal historical resources being joined to sort of things from outside, basically. And out of that combination, you get a new dynamic civilization. Now, the question, though, I think for China and for all sort of non-Western societies right now is that what's happening? Right? Is China going to sort of pass us in some sense? Or is there a kind of convergence in decadence that is going to happen to sort of the rest of the world? And that I don't know the answer to that question, but I think
China will have to choose that if it is going to pass us economically, let's say, that might be at the cost of a kind of convergence of moral decadence.
Yes, right, but I suppose you would sort of, this is where decadence becomes a kind of amoral, or dynamism can be an amoral category too, right? Like, I think you could say that China could pass us by becoming more evil than us while also being non-decadent, right? A China that was breeding genetic supermen to rule the world would not be a decadent society. It might be an evil one, but it wouldn't be decadent.
Right. Good distinction. Yeah.
Well, it's tricky, right? Because you want, but there's also a sense in which if you look at, China has a lot of the problems of a
Right.
sort of advanced Western democracy. It has the demographic problem, right?
Right.
Like it's in danger of growing old before it grows rich. It has, there are a lot of questions about China's institutions that are sort of being highlighted by the sort of tiptoeing back towards totalitarianism under the current government. And you could imagine a world where in 50 years' time, Chinese growth rates have slowed dramatically. They've hit the same kind of technological ceiling that we've had, and they have a sort of more nakedly authoritarian police state, and we have a sort of softer internet-enabled pink police state, to borrow a phrase from our mutual friend James Poulos.
Yeah.
But we're sort of different pictures of decadence, but we're also kind of the same. And I think that's a totally plausible future, not the only plausible future, but a future in which China, India, and what is in certain ways the least decadent continent of all, Africa, develop towards where we are, but don't sort of go off on a track that takes them past us.
Here's I'm gonna put forth a couple of theories, and you can take up either or neither. I think it's very interesting to see that I think I might want to make the argument that China's developing social credit system, where the internet is being used as a means of shaming people into proper behavior, is a way to try to use the internet in a way very different than Western corporations use the internet. They're using the internet to manipulate us and control us as a way behind the scenes. But for China, it's all very much up front. If you fail to pay your bills, you can find your picture on a billboard. As you can be denied the right to buy train tickets or plane tickets. And that strikes me as an attempt to use the internet as a way to head off moral decadence, in a way to keep people morally upright, and a way to keep people, the society, well policed. And that's a very odd way to use the internet.
But isn't it a means? I mean, ultimately, though, of sort of it's social control, not moral uplift, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it seems to me much closer to, like, you wouldn't call Huxley's Brave New World a society where, sort of moralism is triumphant. It's a society where social control is triumphant, and people are expected to sort of behave in some way that lines up with some conception of morality, but it's not, there's no sort of Victorian style sense of like we're building a virtuous citizenry, right? I mean, to me, the internet, I mean, this is the dystopian narrative, unless you like really buy the case for decadence, which maybe we should. But if you don't, there's an argument that the internet is sort of the technology that ends all other technologies, right? That it's the technology that sort of makes people turn inward in this sort of profound way and makes them content with what they have, because they have this sort of perpetual illusion. Well, this sort of perpetual stimulation, but also this sort of perpetual illusion of sort of great activity, right? Like in politics, right? I think this is the big question hanging over the relationship between the internet and American politics right now. It could be that the internet is deranging American politics, polarizing American politics, and bringing back the 1930s or 1968. And if you go on Twitter, that's what you would think. Right? It's like, the internet, it's full of neo-Nazis, and it's full of, Marxists and socialists and communists, and it's just full of really angry people.
And therefore, America is also full
and therefore America is full of these people, and they're going to be fighting in the streets. But it's also possible that the internet is it's play acting, right? It's
Soporific.
You're play acting the 1930s on your Twitter feed, but you're actually less likely to, either fight in the streets, and I'm not endorsing fighting in the streets, or sort of do like the base, sort of normal work of civic life, of sort of, mobilization and organization and so on, you're actually less likely to make political change because you have this like,
Hey, I had the right hashtag. What
right,
more do you want
right,
from me? Yeah.
Right. I'm not sure that that's right. And certainly Western politics has become more unstable in certain ways in the last 5 years, which suggests that I could be wrong, and you could ultimately, it could be that we're play acting now,
Right.
but it's setting in motion a bigger destabilization that really will bring back the 1930s. But I think it is possible, in Brave New World, in this dystopia that Aldous Huxley imagines, there's this thing, I think it's called a violent passion surrogate, where you basically go in, he's writing the 1920s, so he's not anticipating the internet, but you go in and you have some like virtual reality / chemical experience that makes you feel like you're Othello strangling Desdemona or something. And then you go out and you go back to your ordinary life and nobody has to murder anybody, and it's great. You get that out of your system. And sometimes I think that's what this technology builds, and it's like pornography, right? Like when we had this pornographic revolution in American society 40 odd years ago, and people were sure that it was going to make men more likely to be rapists and murderers, right? Exactly. How could it not? Have you looked at Hustler and Penthouse and so on? These are degradation of women and so on. And you go back and look at 80s debates about porn and sort of feminists and religious conservatives coming together. That was what they were coming together about, this assumption that there was going to be an epidemic of rape and sexual violence caused by porn. 30 years later, the evidence kind of points the other way, that porn is a substitute for some men, at least, for sort of violent acting out in the real world, and its main effect is it's a numbing effect, right? Yeah. That it's but it's also a stabilizing effect. You really maybe do get fewer rapists in a pornographic, sort of internet-enabled society than you would have in the old world. It's just you also get men who are generally sort of overstimulated to the point of numbness, and you get a sort of weird decline of sex.
Yeah. So in this, it's the argument about whether violent video games make people more or less violent is just getting replicated in other arenas. So you could make the argument that if indeed the scenario that you've just laid out is accurate, then what we have, and by the way, I'm going to connect something. I'm going to go back to the China example just for a moment, just to say that I actually think the social credit system in China, the developing social credit system in China, where you try to control people's behavior by means of internet-enabled technologies that would shame them for doing the wrong thing, I think that's a kind of a tacit admission that the people are not morally strong enough to do what they want to without this external stimulation, right?
Your filial piety is not sufficient.
Yeah,
right.
It's not, and so it's, in a way, it's almost like an admission that decadence has to some extent set in, and it has to be fought with these technological means. And so sometimes you can maybe have a situation that's not as overtly bad as it could be, and that's, I think, what you just described with the results of the porn revolution. You're not getting you're not getting overt, unquestionable, obviously immensely destructive evil, but you could say, but you are getting decadence.
Yes, I think that's you can. I think that is a correct description of what has happened in the West over the last 30 years in general. I think the porn and crime thing is just a piece of the pantomime. You had this social revolution in the 60s and 70s that was dynamic and associated with all kinds of massive social problems.
Right.
Above all, an incredibly high crime wave that made cities ungovernable and incredibly dangerous and killed lots of people.
Yeah.
And the sort of the public response to it, ultimately, the political response was itself, it sort of met chaos with cruelty, right? And so you have mass incarceration, you have a lot of people who sort of tacitly support abortion on the theory that, like, well, you have so much family breakdown, you got to do something about people having kids out of wedlock. These kids are just going to grow up to be criminals anyway.
Right.
And so you have, for a period, really high incarceration rates and really high abortion rates. And social conservatives sort of told this story where, okay, liberalization led to social breakdown inevitably, and the more liberal a society gets, the more chaotic it gets. Mm-hmm. But then in the last 20 years, we've sort of, abortion rates have gone down. We've started to move away from mass incarceration. Crime has stayed low. Society is pretty stable. But it's a stability that is sort of sterile, right? So like, it's not that sort of the two-parent family of the 1950s has made a comeback. Mm-hmm. It's that people are just, pairing off less. People are getting married less, having less sex, having fewer children. It's this sort of, it's like this, the stability of the grave, almost. And is that better than the New York of like Charles Bronson and Death Wish and so on? Right. I mean, they're different, right? One is more dangerous and more dynamic and more cruel and more interesting, right? And one is more stable and more humane in certain ways, but sort of more, more sterile. I think sterility is the best way to look at it. So it's not a simple it's not a simple story of like, decadence and moral decay and social collapse all mixed together. Sometimes you get social collapse from dynamism, and you get stability from from the end of dynamism and just a sort of slumping surrender.
Right. And sometimes the slumping surrender can be something that you can surrender to. You can surrender to entertainment.
Yes.
Right? Are we not entertained?
There's 15 new shows on Netflix, literally in the time it took us to have this conversation.
I was, a few years ago, I was walking through Times Square about 10 o'clock one night with the theologian Chuck Matthews.
Sounds like the beginning of a really good joke.
Yeah, well, it isn't why. And we had been talking earlier that day about our mutual love for the movie Vanya on 42nd Street, in which you see a much earlier and very, very different Times Square, right? This is the Times Square of crumbling buildings and junkies on the side of the street. And so we're walking there under the flashing lights of the CNN, and everything. And I said to Chuck, which do you think Augustine would hate more? The Times Square of 1975 or the Times Square of 2015? And Chuck said, I don't think that's a difficult question at all. I think 2015 would be far more appalling to him because of the ways in which it so skillfully hides the corruption, which maybe is what decadent societies do, that they do a fairly good job of covering it up. So I've got time to ask you one more question before we then turn over to Q&A. You can see, folks, that we have microphones here, which you can come to if you have questions you want to ask. But let me put one last question of my own to you. John Adams famously said, and other founders said the same thing, that the American constitutional system was designed for a moral people. And without a certain moral strength among the people, the system isn't going to work. It depends upon that.
Right.
Have we found that to be true? And do we now lack, as Americans, the moral fiber necessary to make this system work? This goes back to a comment I was making earlier about Congress. A Congress who has not had its prerogatives taken away from it, but has willingly given them up to an increasingly imperial presidency, something which, of course, did not start with Donald Trump. Or can we just not run our institutions anymore. They're perfectly good if we were the right people to run them, but we're not the right people to run them.
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with Adams. At the same time, I think it is, as with everything, it's sort of, there's a tangle here, right, where it's not just that we are less moral and therefore we can't make the system work. It's also that, systems become sclerotic. It's easier to build a new system than reform an existing one, right? It was easier for Franklin Roosevelt to do the whole New Deal than it was for Barack Obama to pass Obamacare, which,
right.
Changed the healthcare system in in the scope of history in a pretty modest way. And so there's sort of, again, I think there's a sort of feedback loop there too, right? Where it's like, sort of moral decay leads to disillusionment with public figures, but so does sort of political decay, right? Where like, even when you get your leader in who you like, they can't do something, and then that feeds further disillusionment and further pessimism and so on. So I think it's not, the American Constitution was written a long time ago, and we had for a long time a process whereby you could amend the Constitution, right? And it was, as wise as the founders were, it was also essential that at various points, Civil War most notably, that it was possible to amend it and change it in ways that sort of enabled the system to sort of hang together and reflect moral revolutions and sort of change, sort of the great battles of American life. And you can't amend the American Constitution anymore. Like, that's crazy. You can't possibly get through all the veto points. Like, everybody sort of understands that, right? We haven't had a major amendment, again, since that last period of dynamism in the 60s and 70s. Right. So, so if that's the case, even when people have a certain kind of moral imagination, or if they end up frustrated by the institutions, then that moral imagination sort of curdles, right? And I mean, just to take like both Donald Trump and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez are in very different ways kind of rebels against decadence in this interesting way. Like the appeal of Trump, let's say the more positive appeal of Trump, it's this idea of, well, why can't, we used to do big things in America, right? Like, people laugh at Donald Trump's Space Force, but that's the best of Trumpism, right? This idea that, hey, we used to send people to the moon. What happened to that? Remember that? Let's do, let's do that again. But why are our highways so terrible? Why can't we build bridges anymore? Let's get back to that. And the Green New Deal is basically the same impulse on the left. It's like, why can't we just, we had the Manhattan Project, we had the Apollo Project, why can't we just do the same thing and sort of solve climate change in this big, huge, national endeavor? And I think the problem is that, it's not just, I think, as a conservative, I think there are deep moral problems with the left's vision. And as a Christian, I think there are deep moral problems with Donald Trump's vision. So I don't want to hold up either side of our politics as sort of moral. I think they both fail John Adams's test. But there are impulses there, right? There are sort of desires for something better that are not, even if they were perfected, would still run into these sort of, structural and institutional and bureaucratic realities, right? And so I think it's not as simple as to say that, we have this system that needs a moral people and we don't have a moral people anymore. It's that, we have a people who are disillusioned about government and skeptical of improvement and polarized into warring camps, in part because the system, like the society as a whole, has grown old. And we are rich enough and technologically proficient enough that we can keep it. I mean, this is the deeper question, right? Which is, in Adams's story, right? If you go back to the example of Rome that everyone always returns to, republics decay and they get replaced, right? And I think the question that I'm not sure of the answer to is, are we headed in that direction? Is there some straightforward story you can tell where, we have moral decay and institutional sclerosis and we're waiting for Augustus, right? We're waiting for Augustus. Or is it the case that, that we aren't going to get Augustus, and we're just going to sort of go on like this for an unexpectedly long time?
Could happen. I said that was going to be the last question, but just real quickly following up, can we see these stirrings on both with Trump, it's not the right, really, is it? It's populism.
Trump is the right.
Trump is the right?
Well, Trump belongs to the right. He's not a movement conservative,
right,
but he belongs to the right, broadly understood.
So from the right and the left, and can we see these movements as at least providing some hope that this society is not willing to be decadent, that it wants to avoid the stagnation, that it's looking even at the cost of radical disruption of not settling into stagnation, which could be worse, right? I mean, maybe stagnation would be better than what these things could bring.
No, I mean, and this is frankly why, again, I'm more favorably disposed than some conservatives to the new socialism, and even though I was part of, what gets called Never Trump, I don't have this sort of Trump is destroying everything reaction to his administration that some anti-Trump conservatives have. I think, there are ways in which the flailing against decadence, that, electing a reality TV billionaire to the presidency and, turning a Bronx congresswoman into this weird mix of, Daenerys Targaryen and
our future empress
our
for life.
Future empress for life. Well, right. I joke around about this in the column. We got to joke a little bit, but there is something. Yeah, I think there's something. I mean, the problem with the case for decadence is that there is some real sense of human possibility, even if that disappears with decadence. Even if even if you can be afraid of the alternatives to decadence, and you should be, it's still hard not to sort of root for the disruptors at some level. And in that sense, Trump and AOC are in different ways signs that, that we're not where we seem to be when it was Obama versus Romney in the most boring, stupid presidential election of my lifetime. I started working on the Decadence Project after 2012, and it was all right, we're just stuck. Nothing interesting is ever going to happen again. And so some interesting things are happening. Yes. So that's I'm a journalist. I'm not going to root against interesting things happening, right?
Nor should you. Okay, folks, come and ask questions. You can see there's a microphone over here, and there's one over here. Matt Anderson, I can't believe you got up to ask a question.
Shocking.
Shock.
Ross, thanks very much. Chesterton somewhere has this line that goes something like, when the martial virtues among a people decline, the power of the military increases. I've been interested in the lack of the discussion of warfare, military conflicts in the discussion of decadence tonight. And I wonder about a pessimistic case for the emergence of dynamism, right? The dynamism that's forced upon us on the basis of external threats, and things like the technologically sublime moment of going to the moon, being in one sense just animated by a sense of hostility or animus towards those communists over there and this Cold War. Is it the case that efforts, these sort of green shoots of dynamism that you're pointing to on the right and the left, notwithstanding, might it not be the case that what we really will need is something like a strong global conflict to wake Western societies out of decadence? And at that point, is it already too late? Thanks.
So, I think the war question is a kind of case study in why decadence is such it's so morally complex, right? Why it sort of resists easy, like, oh, it's just morally bad, it's just moral decline, right? Because wars are bad, not always, but generally they're bad things, and yet they are also clearly a source of competition, achievement, human greatness, dynamism, right? All of these things. But the problem that you get into is that you can't. It is ultimately immoral to try and sort of force your way to the end of decadence by sort of throwing yourself into war, right? Like, we have a lot of case studies of that. You can see part of World War I as like, this sort of feeling in late 19th century Europe of, in certain ways, sort of an earlier stirring of the sentiments that I'm describing here, that then leads people to sort of hurl themselves into visions of national glory that ultimately end up hastening the sort of Western Europe today is much more decadent precisely because it went through it sort of destroyed itself in a huge civil war. It didn't renew itself, right? Like the China example, right? You could say that the Chinese civil wars and the Great Leap Forward and everything were these horrible, nightmarish things, but at the end of it, it did create a context in which there could be Chinese renewal. The wars of Europe in the first half of the 20th century had the opposite effect, right? And there's sort of a micro example of this not a micro example for people directly involved in it, in our own history, right? I graduated from college in 2001. 9/11 happened, and everyone I knew had this sense that like decadence was over. It was like there was like 6 months to 4 years, depending on your perspective, where there was this feeling of like, okay, we had the Cold War, and then we had this little period that we called the end of history that was decadent, and now we have an enemy again. Now we have a challenge again. Now we have a reason to fight and seek greatness and all of these things, and that was wrong. And it was wrong in a way. It wasn't wrong because Al-Qaeda wasn't a threat, but Al-Qaeda wasn't like a world historical threat on the scale of the Soviet Union. And a lot of people, liberals and conservatives, especially conservatives, temporarily convinced themselves that it was. And we ended up embroiled in a war in Iraq that had disastrous consequences without creating any kind of dynamism or any of the sort of positive externalities of war. I think are very hard to see from our post 9/11 adventures. And we ended up in 15 years later, we've sort of ended up in a kind of decadent way of war, right? Where we have wars that are again, it sort of parallels what I was trying to say about the crime wave and abortion and so on. You have this period where we're like, terrorism is this huge problem and we have to deal with it by invading Middle Eastern countries and building democracy. And then that didn't work out, but then we're like, actually terrorism is a problem that we can manage with drone warfare and special forces and a professionalized military, and people in America are barely aware of the 37 countries that we have troops in, and it's sort of a sustainable, invisible way of war that is, again, like the Chinese social credit system. It's sort of dedicated to like the management of stability. That's where we've ended up. But like all I'm saying is the attempt to sort of like create this return of history after 9/11 ended badly. So you can't just it would end decadence, right, if China emerged fully as the great rival with which we had to contend or be defeated by. But you can't root for a war with China. Like, that would be terrible, right? So I feel like that's sort of the core dilemma in certain ways facing a decadent civilization, that there are the ways out lie through forms of conflict that can bring out dynamism and human greatness, but it's very dangerous to wish for them, and if you try to invent them, you may end up just making things much worse.
Yeah. We'll be going back and forth this way, so we'll see if we can get everybody in. I'm not
I'll
sure
try
what
and give shorter answers. I'm sorry.
That was Matt's fault. I blame
It was
Matt.
totally,
yes.
it's
Okay,
never
so
the speaker's fault.
You're next.
So you talked about the internet as a potentially sedative force in society, and I was wondering about what you think about the things like you've seen riots and in several cities, and you see marches, I guess, happening fairly often. And it seems like the internet kind of enables these kinds of things. So do you see that as being, actually, I remembered I was in Oxford, and of course that's England, but I think it's
an exotic culture over there.
Steve Bannon came to talk in Oxford, and there was this complete, people just flooded the streets so that no one could get around because they just didn't want him to come. And it seems that the internet has kind of enabled these kinds of things to happen more easily. So is that a real mobility, or is it just kind of a facade of one?
I'm not sure. I think that there are clearly ways in which the internet can create, it creates flash mobs, right? It creates a possibility for coordination among activists that wasn't possible before. There was a whole wave of coverage of the Arab Spring, right, that argued that basically, the internet was just clearly the enemy of authoritarian governments because it enabled activists to network and mobilize outside the control of the state. And again, I think we won't know really for 100 years, right? We don't have enough data right now. I just think that there is a certain amount of data that suggests that at the very least, there's evidence that it can be used as a force for social control rather than for this kind of, activist energy, right? Like the story of China over the last 20 years is like Westerners are like, oh man, the internet in China, that's the end for Beijing, that's the end of communist authoritarianism. And so far, this may not last, but so far it's quite the opposite. The successful use of the internet in this as sort of a means of social control is remarkable. But even in the U.S., I just, if you compare the level of sort of activity, right, real world activity in American culture in the age of Trump versus American culture in the late 60s and early 70s, there's just no comparison.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention that point. If you look at the early 70s, daily newspaper reports, bombings, kidnappings, shooting of police, riots. I mean, it was completely insane in comparison to what we have now. The levels of violent political activity were so far beyond what we have, which I think speaks to some extent to your tentative thesis anyway, that people get a lot of it out of their system by ranting on the internet.
But maybe the internet is real, right? Like maybe it's a mistake, maybe it's a category error to say, oh, that's virtual, it's not happening in the real world. If people are living their lives online and being shamed online and having their lives ruined online, I mean, at a certain point, maybe I'm making an artificial distinction, and the what's happening on Twitter isn't play acting, it's just politics, right?
That's definitely true, and that's definitely important, but I think I'd rather be shamed on the internet than kidnapped and shot. That may just be me. So,
you haven't clearly don't have my commenters, but
no, I don't. Yes.
I work for NASA, so I want to pull out some of the comments you've made on technological progress and frame that into a question for you. At the agency at NASA, I think we almost used to look at technological progress in Hegelian terms. This technological world spirit was kind of moving us forward, and whenever we completed a project, kind of the natural follow-on kind of arose out of the ground almost, and then we naturally embraced it. We were just the clay that this surreal potter was forging. What actually is happening at the agency now is something very different and far more curious. because we've got the capabilities to do a lot of things. We could go to Mars and explore a planet we've never been to. We could colonize the moon and set up this self-sustaining human colony. We could look inward. Our moonshot could be global warming. We could build a bunch of satellites and do all this data to help with the climate change problem. Instead, for a generation, for 20 years, we've drifted aimlessly, among tepid commitments to tepid objectives. And maybe out of all that institutional impotence, the private sector now has taken over the role that NASA used to. Billionaires with egos to match are now dueling each other for the things that we used to do institutionally. So my question to you is, what does it mean for kind of the romance of a people, which the space program at its best embodied, to have been kind of outsourced or pushed out to non-governmental actors, to private citizens almost? And is that unique? It seems to me that while we always admired the captains of industry in America, we never looked at Carnegie or Rockefeller. I mean, we thought they were competent businessmen, but we never saw them as the embodiment of what it meant to be knit together as Americans. But now we seem quite comfortable with ceding our collective romance to individuals and let them play it out with each other, kind of like the Greek gods play it out.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think you could, there's a case that, again, to sort of go back to the idea that like this period from 1900 to 1950 or something was unusual, right? I mean, there's a case that the sort of Bezos versus Musk dynamic is actually pretty normal in historical terms, right? And it's, the age of discovery was, it had a strong political component of countries competing against each other, but it was also a lot of, egomaniacal, what was the Jamestown settlement if not, a bunch of investors in England, getting really excited and sending people off to basically die of malaria anyway. So in that sense, I don't know, like you don't want to sort of take this American moment, 1925 to 1975, and say that's the only way that great things can be done, right? I don't want to undersell the possibility that like out of sort of Silicon Valley's surplus, you could get a sort of, a kind of private sector escape from decadence, right? I think that's possible, and it doesn't have to be the case that the sort of NASA model from the glory of the Apollo program is the only way to do it. At the same time, I think it's obvious that there is a sort of a sense in which political conditions shape people's sense of the possible, right? And the political conditions in which the Apollo program took place was a case of sort of not just sort of this kind of Hegelian technology feeding on technology, but also technology feeding on this sense of political mastery, right? This sense that we can, the government can do big projects. The government can, win a huge war against the Axis powers. And it sort of, it fit in this way that is very hard. That was a really impressive thing that is very hard to recover. And I mean, again, I think one of the admirable things about, the new socialists is that they think that can be brought back, right? They think that you can say, all right, we have this crisis of climate change and we're going to rise to meet it. But I think everybody is reasonably skeptical that will actually work, that that you could do. I mean, it's much, I said this already, but it's much easier to do a New Deal when nobody's ever done a New Deal before than it is to do a Green New Deal in the context of this huge, advanced, expensive welfare state that already is running tremendous deficits and is sort of, where our economic prosperity is sort of constantly deficit financed because we don't have enough young people to. Anyway, this is not an answer to your question. It's more sort of a rumination. But I think with the space question, though, it's like are we not going to Mars because we've hit technological limitations? Are we not going to Mars because the culture isn't interested in exploration? Or are we not going to Mars because space turned out to be sort of big and hard to explore and people feel like there just isn't enough there? I don't know, right? But I think there's a lot about decadence is sort of distilled in the case of the space program. Like, it's crazy. If you I watched First Man, and I haven't seen Apollo 11, which is the new documentary that's out that's like just footage from the moon landing. But, we went to the moon, this is like something that was done 50 years ago.
Yeah.
And in spaceships that looked like they were like stuck together with, with duct tape. And here we are sitting here with our sleek iPhones, like, man, we went to the moon. That was kind of remarkable.
Back in the day.
Back in the day. It's just a weird moment.
If we were to decide to go to the moon again and had 10 years to do it, we couldn't do it now.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's strive for
Faster.
concision.
Yes, I'm
We're
sorry,
gonna
but
have-
he brought up the space.
I know,
Space
that's
is
right.
just...
We're going to strive for concision in both questions and answers. So-
Much shorter question. In thinking about technology that, if it became ubiquitous, would seem to make society more dynamic, a couple examples come to mind. One is remotely piloted automobiles in general, but aircraft specifically, and then also CRISPR. And in fact, the description you just gave of like going to the moon, every time I hear a kind of really articulate description of CRISPR, I get that kind of sensation. And it seems like the difference is that CRISPR is not the sort of thing that has maybe lived its fullest potential yet. But if it did, it seemed like maybe it would change our relations, dependency relations between maybe the ill and the feeble and their caretakers and so forth. All sorts of things would change. And I'm wondering why you think, you said something at the beginning, you don't think we're on the verge of some sort of breakthroughs in these advances that would make, that would seem to contradict the thesis that we're decadent according to your definition. So I'm just wondering why you're pretty confident in that.
I'm not really confident. I think that CRISPR is a case where if it fulfills its potential, then it's an obvious catalyst for the end of decadence, right? Like but to fulfill its potential, it has to lead to, to dramatic, I don't want to say, I mean, I had the joke about China building a race of supermen, but that's not a joke. Like, if you go back to Star Trek, right? Star Trek, a show about the future made in sort of this period that I'm arguing was like the last non-decadent period. In Star Trek's timeline of the future, the 1990s featured the eugenics wars, which is, so basically when Star Trek was conceived of, and they were projecting forward, they were like, all right, by the 1990s, we're going to have genetic engineering on such a scale that we will have basically supermen who end up being Khan in the Wrath of Khan. I mean, right. So it's like who end up getting banished, and laws have to be passed against it. I don't remember how the timeline works out, but like that was sort of the 60s perspective, right? That CRISPR in some form was coming, and it was going to lead to wars and revolutions, basically. And that may be happening. It may be that was right, and it's just going to happen in the 2030s, right? Yeah. So I totally accept that possibility. At the same time, I think it's possible that, as with a lot of sort of promised innovations, you will end up getting, some successes that are like we've had a lot of incredible success in medicine dealing with sort of edge cases over the last 30 years, where we've had, sort of diseases that affect a very small group of people. We've made real progress on treating them. We've had a lot less progress on Alzheimer's, cancer, the sort of, the big diseases that sort of, affect tons of people and affect basic life expectancy and so on. And I could imagine sort of CRISPR ending up being sort of another kind of boutique step forward where, and by boutique, I don't mean something that sounds dismissive. It's not at all dismissive if you're, if you have a family member affected by a genetic disorder, that's, obviously it would be a huge thing if you could, eliminate certain genetic disorders in utero and so on. But you could imagine it being something that has this really strong effect on marginal cases, but doesn't get to the point of like, we're engineering humans to have super intelligence or something, right? So it's like, I mean, again, this is a crude sci-fi heuristic, but crude sci-fi heuristics are useful. If CRISPR gets you Khan, it's the end of decadence. If it gets you Khan from the Wrath of Khan, the genetic Superman. If it gets you some impressive cures for genetic disorders in the womb, it probably isn't the end of decadence. And then there's lots of territory in between. But that's sort of how I think about it. I mean, in the 1990s, when I was a teenager, it was, cloned sheep were on the cover of Time magazine. It was like, well, everybody, we're going to have human cloning constantly, and this was sort of in the popular culture. This was sort of taken for granted, and then it turned out there were all kinds of obstacles, serious scientific obstacles, and that turned out to be a big technological breakthrough that didn't produce any kind of social revolution. We didn't get the clone wars, right? So I'm just sort of, that informs a little bit of skepticism that I have that CRISPR will be as revolutionary as a science fiction novelist might imagine it to be.
We only have time for one more, I'm afraid. I'm sorry about that.
I'm sorry.
I wish that I had prepared a question about Star Trek. I could have talked.
We didn't even get my Star Wars and decadence argument, but you can ask me about it afterward.
I had a feeling you were going to request concision, so I wrote mine down. I guess that's good. In Bad Religions, you mentioned the importance of Fulton Sheen, who of course brought kind of a mainstream recognition of the Catholic Church to a mid-20th century audience through television, of course. And I wonder, do you think that a figure in today's world could bring that same result, or has the history of the church created too much cynicism for a modern audience to even care?
It certainly couldn't be someone like Sheen, right? So, I mean, Sheen traded on sort of exotic authority. He sort of showed up in this hyper-modern medium, first radio, and then television in this sort of full pre-Vatican II bishop's regalia. But he was sort of trading on, I think, the kind of, even to people who are anti-Catholic, the kind of mystery and authority of the pre-Vatican II church. And I think in the Western world, that's just sort of gone. And I think this is something that, I'm a professional critic of Pope Francis in certain contexts. But I think something that Francis demonstrated, especially in the first year of his pontificate in a really powerful way, was that, the best way to sort of capture the attention of a disenchanted world as the Pope or as a Catholic figure now is not to try and trade on authority, but to try and sort of create a kind of public imitatio Christi, where you're sort of trying to take the imagery of the New Testament and bring it to life in modern times. So the image of Francis kissing the man with boils on his face, like those kind of images. There's a reason that Mother Teresa is sort of the defining sort of pop culture saint of modern times. So in that sense, I think the idea of sort of humility and radicalism that Francis at his best has sort of embodied is really the only way to kind of capture right now the kind of media attention that Sheen was able to capture. The sort of official symbols of Catholicism are just sort of, it doesn't mean that they aren't important to the church's recovering its self-understanding or rebuilding itself from within, but you're not going to go on television in Catholic regalia and sort of command an audience in the way that he was able to do.
So the young Pope isn't a documentary in advance of the... Maybe not.
Well, I think there's sort of two arguments, right? I think the problem with the sort of with the Francis approach is a problem for the internal life of the church, right? Which is that the church lacks internal self-confidence, internal cohesion, internal unity. It's sort of put aside all its old it's put aside lots of its old symbols and traditions and so on. And so there's a case that you need, that there's elements of sheen that are needed within the church, but that's a kind of internal rebuilding, and you can't expect that to, sort of Sheen was like, I'm grabbing a primetime audience in a secular culture. Like, you can think, and you might be right, that like the traditionalism of Raymond Cardinal Burke is what the Catholic Church needs in the long run to rebuild itself. But Cardinal Burke couldn't be Fulton Sheen he couldn't be an evangelist on primetime TV right now in that kind of way. So it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's complicated is a good way to stop. I'm so sorry we couldn't get to all the questions, but we have to have time for you to go out and buy books and for Ross to sign them. So would you join me in thanking Ross for
Thank
being
you,
here
guys.
this evening?
Thank you, Alan.